writer of the book 50 Years of Exponent 2, which was published with Signature Books as well, and she lives in Saratoga Springs, Utah. So let's welcome Katie Rich.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman, and thank you, Snow College. I'm so happy to be here. Happy almost finals week. If I would have known that the stage was going to be set up for a band concert, I would have brought my 13-year-old and his baritone to do a special performance, but alas, 3 years ago, my co-writer Heather Sundell and I set out to write an original history of Exponent 2. This Mormon feminist organization began as a quarterly newspaper in Boston in 1974. If you just thought Mormonism and feminism together, you're not alone. One of the most common reactions that Mormon feminists get is that those terms sound like an oxymoron. And then there are the critics, because Exponent 2 has always had critics. They tend to split into two camps: those who think it is way too radical, and those who think it is not radical enough. At a recent event, some friends and I asked ChatGPT to roast Exponent 2. Somehow it managed to thread the needle of both camps of criticism. Exponent 2, 50 years of almost radical. Here's to half a century of making feminism in the LDS world feel like a mocktail party with just a hint of rebellion. And while you're at it, keep those heartfelt essays coming, because nothing says smashing the patriarchy like a beautifully formatted magazine. You've got the spirit of Joan of Arc, if Joan had to ask her bishop for permission before going into battle. Ouch, ChatGPT. Almost radical, like whose side are you on? Today I'll explore how Exponent 2 walks this line. What feels moderate in one context can seem downright subversive in another context. Emerging from church-sanctioned projects, Exponent 2 felt to its founders like a natural extension of their interests and talents by prioritizing community over ideological purity. It became a space where Mormon feminists could reconcile their identities and expand the boundaries of both. Picture this. It's a sweltering day in the summer of 1974. A group of women gathers at the Boston area home of Marianne McMurray. The house was alive with the sound of babies and toddlers underfoot and the chaos of the family packing up to move. Amidst all of this, these women, Mormon housewives, graduate students, and young professionals, are starting something extraordinary. It's the first pace-up party for a newspaper they've named Exponent 2. Months of effort have led to this moment, and the pieces, literally pieces, are on the table. A paragraph here, a single line retyped there, all need to be painstakingly assembled and proofread with hand-drawn art added before headed to the printer. These women know conditions aren't perfect, but they press on. In the first editorials, Claudia Bushman articulated their purpose. Exponent 2 stood on what she called the dual platforms of Mormonism and feminism. Their goals: to strengthen the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and to encourage the talents of Mormon women. To them, these aims weren't contradictory. They were complementary. They hoped the paper would become like a letter from a dear friend, sharing women's lives, interests, and concerns. But their idealism was quickly tested. To these women, their work was an act of devotion, not rebellion. They saw themselves as faithful members of the church, not radicals. But church leaders in Salt Lake City saw it differently. The women were stunned when an apostle flew to Boston to urge them to shut down the paper. Before long, their dual platforms of Mormonism and feminism began to feel more like dueling identities. And as the LDS Church joined a national coalition against the Equal Rights Amendment, the conflict between their faith and their feminist ideals grew sharper. It may sound radical for a group of women who met in Relief Society, the LDS Church's organization for women, to found a feminist newspaper. But for this particular group of women in Boston, it felt like a natural and almost inevitable development. Boston in the 1960s was a hub of the Mormon diaspora. In the post-World War II era, increasing numbers of Latter-day Saints who'd been born in Utah or the Intermountain West went to Boston for school or work. Boston had an incredible number of institutions of higher education, and Mormons would go to Boston for work or school, many staying for a short time, but others settling there permanently. It was in this transient It was this transient nature of the LDS community in Boston that led to the first publishing project among these women. It begins with A Beginner's Boston. Bishop Van Eidert had had enough. He was tired of seeing church members from the Intermountain West come to Boston and move into the Cambridge ward and complain for the first 2 years before they found their footing. So he proposed a solution. The ward should create a practical guidebook for living in Boston, and the idea was that it could help newcomers and also be a fundraiser for the ward. When he pitched the idea to the ward council, the elders quorum, many of them Harvard Business School fellows, shot the idea down because they were sure it would not make money. But the Relief Society president, Bonnie Horn, had a different idea. The women would take it on. With Laurel Thatcher Ulrich leading the effort, A Beginner's Boston was born in 1966. It was a team effort. Carolyn Peters provided the artwork, Luann Van Eidert typed the manuscript, and many ward members wrote small sections and contributed in a number of ways. They sent an advance copy to the Boston Globe, which gave them a glowing review. Before they knew it, they sold out their initial run of 1,000 copies before the books even arrived, and over the years and a few different editions, they sold nearly 23,000 copies of this little guidebook. Not only did the book raise money for the ward, funds that went towards things like a new fridge in their chapel, updated curtains for the Relief Society room, and even paying babysitters for weekday Relief Society meetings, it also built women's confidence. More importantly, it showcased the power of collaboration within the Relief Society, where women worked together, built friendships, and accomplished big things. But this was just the beginning. Fast forward to June 1970. At the height of the women's movement, Ulrich invited a group of friends from Relief Society to her home. The topic? Gender roles, equal rights, and what feminism meant in their lives, especially as Mormon women. Nationwide, women were meeting in living rooms for talking circles, also called consciousness-raising groups. Their discussions included issues like birth control, women in the workplace, and this group also questions unique to their faith. Should they accept every church calling? Was living for others a noble virtue or a form of self-erasure? This group of women, though united by faith, came to feminism from very different backgrounds. Ulrich had been given a copy of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique from her ward organist. Judy Dushku, a new comparative politics professor at Suffolk University, came to feminism by way of the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. Claudia Bushman, a mother of 6 and new PhD history student, brought insights from Mormon women's history to the group. They disagreed on almost everything. These discussions were kind of miserable at times, and they would leave maybe in tears or with headaches, because they had so many different perspectives. This was not a group who came together and agreed on every point. But the ability to talk openly about these issues was transformative and deeply meaningful. Meanwhile, in Salt Lake City, church leaders were consolidating power through the priesthood correlation movement. The church was growing rapidly, and in an effort to streamline things, they centralized church finances and publications and the building program. The Relief Society, which had previously raised its own money and managed large projects, was now instructed to turn over its funds and operate out of a ward budget directed by priesthood leaders. Further, the church canceled the Relief Society magazine after 55 years without providing a replacement for women's voices. But these women in Boston, for them, women's power in the church wasn't just a theory, it was, or at least had been real. They had come of age in a church where women did big things, managed their own projects, managed their budgets, and made their voices heard. They saw themselves not in conflict with the church, but as partners in a larger mission. In 1970, Claudia Bushman suggested that the Boston group edit and issue of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Building on their success with the Beginner's Boston, she thought the project could channel the energy and frustrations from their consciousness-raising meetings into something impactful. Eugene England, the journal's editor, agreed, and the women began working on what would become the 1971 pink issue, named for its bright magenta cover. The project faced challenges. Some women worried about writing for this and appearing critical of the church. Others feared that the issue wasn't bold enough. Claudia coordinated locally, while Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, studying for her doctorate now in New Hampshire, contributed remotely. They gathered contributions of essays and articles and poetry from people around the country, including historian Juanita Brooks and the church historian Leonard Arrington. Carolyn Peters again provided artwork. Editing the Pink issue highlighted the tensions about the meaning of this new Mormon feminism. The new dialogue editor, Robert Reese, critiqued the issue as insufficiently feminist, suggesting the group tackle controversial topics like polygamy and priesthood. However, the women chose to focus on the lived experience of Mormon women, stories that validated their own realities as they balanced faith, family, and scholarship. Published in 1971, the Pink issue became a landmark of Mormon feminism, sparking further efforts to study Mormon women's history and set the stage for future feminist work. In the fall of 1972, the Cambridge LDS Institute of Religion invited the group to teach a lecture series on Mormon women's history, a field that was still largely unexplored. There was very little to draw from, and they had to do original research on all of the topics they chose. During research at Harvard's Widener Library, Susan Kohler uncovered bound copies of the Woman's Exponent, a then largely forgotten periodical published by Mormon suffragists in Utah in the late 19th century. Reading it, she realized these women are feminists. Inspired, she brought them to her friends. They read through them, initially looking for ancestors, but then being amazed at these stories and the radical things that these women expressed. They turned their lectures into the book Mormon Sisters, Women in Early Utah, and continued with other projects. They started hosting annual dinners to celebrate the Woman's Exponent, using funds from the dinner to fly in interesting speakers like historian Maureen Ursenbach Beecher and Judge Christine Durham. These events celebrated women's history and showcased the organizational talents the women had honed in Relief Society. The Boston women who founded Exponent 2 were inspired by the legacy of the Women's Exponent, but they looked to the broader feminist movements of the time as well. They were aware of other feminist groups creating kitchen table style publications, so they decided to start their own newspaper. Here you see pictures of the staff from 1978 assembling in the middle, most of the original founders on the John Harvard statue, iconic photo. And you see kind of an example of the hand-drawn art that was which was their style in the beginning before we move on to a more polished look. Unlike the more radical approaches of some feminist groups, they hoped Exponent 2 would offer something different, an opportunity for Mormon women to gain status, share life stories, and form lasting friendships. In essence, they wanted to give Mormon women a place to explore feminism on their own terms. They named the paper Exponent 2, proudly claiming it as a spiritual descendant of the Woman's Exponent. To their surprise, church leaders challenged the paper repeatedly in its first year and a half, but they remained steadfast, balancing the dual platforms of Mormonism and feminism. For these women living in Boston in the 1960s and 70s, their work, their paper here, hardly seemed radical. Boston was a hub for social justice movements. Martin Luther King Jr. earned his PhD in theology at Boston University and there met his wife, Coretta Scott. In 1965, King led a crowd of 22,000 in a march to Boston Commons in protest of school segregation and racial discrimination in education. In 1971, Boston became home to one of the largest anti-Vietnam War protests as veterans led an anti-war march from famous battle sites in Concord to Lexington. Many of its universities also became robust sites of anti-war protests with sit-ins and shutdowns. In 1971 again, a group of women from Bread and Roses staged a 10-day occupation of 888 Memorial Drive, a Harvard-owned building, calling for affordable education, housing, and childcare. This group went on to found the Cambridge Women's Center, which continues today as an advocacy organization and nonprofit that provides resources for women and gender-expansive folk. The Mormon feminists in Boston, which would go on to found Exponent 2, distanced themselves from these more militant feminist groups. In the Pink issue, Claudia Bushman humorously noted that while they sometimes refer to themselves as the LDS cell of Women's Lib, they were not affiliated with more radical feminist bodies, and some of the Mormon women were so straight-laced that they were shocked by the antics of these groups. Still, they read their literature with interest. These were groups like Boston Female Liberation, also known as Cell 16 for their headquarters at 16 Lexington Avenue. This group published short-lived journals, No More Fun and Games, and The Second Wave, and protested for abortion rights, fought forced sterilization, and pushed for free childcare. Their focus was disrupting traditional gender roles, encouraging women to form different cells of small groups so that it would be decentralized and could not be broken up. Another Boston feminist group, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, began in 1969 to address gaps in women's health knowledge. Even if they would go to their doctors and ask questions about their bodies, they could not get the information that they sought. So they decided to start writing the information themselves. They turned a seminar, Women and Their Bodies, into a pamphlet and then grew it into the landmark book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which tackled sexuality, anatomy, and self-care, even encouraging women to conduct cervical self-exams with speculums and handheld mirrors. While the founders of Exponent 2 admired the efforts of these groups, they carved out a distinct path for themselves. They weren't rejecting marriage or motherhood, home or church. Instead, they used Exponent 2 to explore diverse life paths while staying true to their Mormon faith. Their approach was unique, and while the paper was produced in Boston, it quickly became a national platform, connecting dispersed pockets of Mormon feminists from across the country and soon leading to regional guest edits where groups of Mormon feminists in Colorado, Ohio, Chicago, and other places would gather together in living rooms, have consciousness-raising discussions, and collect content to have an issue of Exponent 2 from that region. In early 1975, the Boston Mormon feminists began hearing that church leaders were concerned about Exponent 2. When they published the first issue of the paper, they ambitiously printed 5,000 copies. They gathered addresses from friends and family members. They would send stacks and ask them to pass them out to their friends. They also flooded the church office building in Salt Lake City with copies of Exponent 2, naively believing that general authorities would be thrilled by the efforts of this group in Boston, and they would give copies to their wives, and they would join in celebration of these efforts. That's not quite how it went. They were told in no uncertain terms to never again send all of these issues to the church office building, and then for good measure, to cancel any subscriptions to general authorities' homes, even if they had been gift subscriptions. The pressure intensified over 1975. Elder Robert D. Hales flew to Boston for a state conference and asked to meet with Claudia Bushman. Hales told Bushman, Exponent 2 should cease. He said it will come to no good. He had submitted one issue of the paper to the Priesthood Correlation Committee, a group led by general authorities who oversaw all church materials, and they felt that it was in no way objectionable except for the art. They felt the art smacked of an underground newspaper, but the actual content of the paper, while substandard in the way it was written, he said, was given their approval. Regardless, Hales feared that the paper might damage the reputation of those involved in the eyes of the church, and that it was improper for Claudia Bushman, as wife of then Boston State President, to edit such a paper. He told her she should resign. Aghast at this news, the staff fasted and prayed about what to do. They decided to write their testimonies to Elder Hales about what the church and this project meant to them. He forwarded their letters to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and Elder L. Tom Perry, who had previously been state president in Boston and knew personally most of the staff members, he was selected to fly out to Boston to meet with them on behalf of the brethren. Elder Perry didn't deliver the death blow that some expected. He said he did not come to tell them to close. That would be their decision, only to caution them, except that is for Claudia Bushman. As wife of the state president, he expected her to step down as editor to avoid the appearance that the publication was church-sanctioned. The disagreement here highlighted different views on what made the church strong. The women of Exponent 2 wanted to showcase the talents of Mormon women and inspire others to contribute to both church and community. The brethren, however, favored a top-down messaging model and a singular vision of womanhood, with the woman's role primarily centered around home and children. Claudia Bushman resigned as editor at the end of 1975. She was not repentant, she said, but she was obedient. Nancy Dredge came on as the second editor, and with the paper's mailbox filling up with letters from around the country from women who found the paper meaningful, the staff continued their work. Bushman's resignation paved the way for Exponent leaders to know how to pass on the work to other leaders and eventually to younger generations. It meant that Exponent 2 would not have a single charismatic leader, but continue to lean towards collaboration. Ironically, because of the pressure by these general authorities, the women had to wrestle with their motives. They fasted, they prayed, they agonized, and they came out of this experience with a stronger commitment to their work, knowing what their intention and their purpose was. Most feminist publications that came out of the women's movement lasted only 2 or 3 years until their founders moved on to other projects. Exponent 2 has continued for 50 years. The path to continue was never smooth. While the Boston women had viewed their brand of feminism as compatible with the church, here and in the years to follow, they found that the dual platforms of Mormonism and feminism would just as often reflect dueling identities. What did Exponent 2's brand of feminism look like? It looked like allowing women to speak for themselves and make room for difference. It's easy to assume that Exponent took a cautious approach out of fear of the opinion of male church leaders, but that's not the case. They took this approach from the beginning out of care for their audience. They knew from their discussions with each other that Mormon women did not share the same opinion. Mormon feminists disagreed with each other on the exact approach of handling and working towards equality. They were intent on listening to one another and meaningfully engaging in the issues that concerned them. My favorite example of this approach comes from the December 1974 issue, where on the same page they printed 2 articles. The first, Truly Brave Women, by Catherine Ann Anderson of San Francisco, argued that women with young children had a God-given responsibility to stay at home with those children while the children were young, if at all possible. In the second article, A Working Mother, Judy Dushku interviewed a woman who was both a doctor and a mother. Her husband was also a working professional, and they hired childcare and split household responsibilities and worked towards partnership in a way that they felt was the right choice for their family. Was the first article feminist? Maybe not, but it reflected a real position that many LDS women held. And by including the first article, readers were more likely to read and consider the second. The approach of making room for difference in Exponent 2 wasn't always easy. A major challenge arose in 1976 when the LDS Church First Presidency came out in opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. They joined in organizing against the Equal Rights Amendment under the guise of grassroots activism. This culminated in the Utah International Women's Year Conference, where LDS Apostle Ezra Taft Benson mobilized nearly 12,000 women, asking wards to send 10 women each to come to the conference. They overwhelmed the conference that was expecting only about 2,000 attendees, with 14,000 women largely voting down every part of the platform, from world peace to greater protections for women against rape. These efforts pitted Mormon housemakers against feminists, framing the ERA as a threat to families. Sonia Johnson, a Rutgers-educated Mormon mother, was shocked by the church's stance and co-founded Mormons for ERA with friends in Virginia in 1977. Her testimony before the Senate on the church's anti-ERA lobbying tactics drew national attention as she went head-to-head with Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah. Johnson's activism included flying a Mormons for ERA Are Everywhere banner over Temple Square during General Conference, and delivered fiery speeches criticizing church patriarchy, ultimately leading the church to excommunicate her in December 1979. Johnson's excommunication shook the Mormon feminist community, prompting Exponent 2 to respond. Editors Nancy Dredge and Diane McKinney restructured the winter 1980 issue to address the event, striving to balance historical context with diverse perspectives. They aimed to provide space for readers to process the implications of the excommunication while fostering sisterhood with one another rather than driving further division. I was editing out the anger, reflected McKinney. When Sonia was excommunicated, we were still trying to be the bridge between the church and women. It was not a time when Exponent was welcoming in the church, and we were walking on eggshells. We were extremely careful with how we phrased things. They wanted to give women a place to speak, but they also wanted women to be heard. The staff struggled with who made decisions about sensitive content. Was it the editors alone or the entire board? Years later, Judy Dushku wrote about the board's agonizing late-night discussions over this issue and coming to vote on each article. Even after the careful decisions, 2 from the group asked for their names to be pulled from the masthead, and 1 person resigned from the board. Behind the scenes, Exponent 2 staff wrestled with how to address controversial topics without alienating readers or provoking church leaders. They often a fine line, prioritizing relationships over ideology and fostering empathetic sharing. This process is exemplified in Judy Dushku's long-running columns Sisters Speak and Sisters Help. Dushku is often seen as the most radical of Exponent 2's founding mothers. Her activism and her academic background bringing ideas to the work. She, as a professor at Suffolk University on Beacon Hill, just a couple blocks from Boston Commons, would often take her students over to Boston Commons after class to hear the different protests and activism that was happening there, just to listen to different ideas. And she would bring those ideas back with her to her friends. But this column, she sought to engage different perspectives. Introduced in 1974, Sisters Speak invited readers to share their thoughts on questions posed by Dushku, with responses published in a subsequent issue. Topics range from abortion, depression, and sexuality to feminist theology. Occasionally, readers' interest drove the topic organically as women would write in about a shared concern. This informal column allowed women to explore complex issues without fear and without the standards of a formal article. They were able to just write a letter and just share their thoughts and feelings. It made space for perspectives that might not align with traditional church views or with any particular brand of feminist ideology. In 1985, Dushku launched Sisters Help, where readers sought advice on personal challenges. She encouraged empathetic responses rather than judgment and preaching, fostering community through shared experiences. Topics include spousal abuse, exclusion from temple weddings of loved ones, and the emotional toll of being a bishop's wife. In one instance, a woman overwhelmed by her husband's role as bishop received practical, compassionate advice from other bishops' wives, underscoring the column's supportive nature. The columns addressed controversial issues in a non-threatening way. It was hard for Mormon women in the 1970s and 1980s to talk about homosexuality and other queer issues. But this column provided an opening to discuss important things as topics came up. When Carolyn Pearson's memoir, Goodbye, I Love You, became a widely read book among Mormon women, it created that opening. And so people started to write in, and they shared experiences with mixed orientation marriages, gay family members, and personal sexuality. This column allowed them to open discussions that were rarely found in other Mormon forums. Importantly, these spaces were not bound by ideological purity, and the responses reflected a range of experiences. They would sometimes critique the church, but other times defend the church, and there was a mix and balance on the page. Dushku prioritized authenticity and mutual understanding rather than orthodoxy. But in the end, is making room for empathy through deep listening radical? It depends on who you ask. And does it need to be radical to serve its purpose? What has changed over 50 years? Exponent 2's founders did not see the paper as a protest against the LDS Church, but it has been revolutionary for its participants. Inspired by the suffragist paper, The Woman's Exponent, they embraced faithful explorations of tensions within Mormonism, feminism, and gender expectations. The paper, through its volunteer labor, has built skills that launched careers in writing, editing, and art, has sent many people to graduate school, and has helped Mormon feminists reconcile dual identities, find community, and make agentive choices. It became a haven for those marginalized in the church and the broader culture. Today, Exponent 2 is one of many spaces that Mormon feminists can go to across various blogs, social media, podcasts, and conferences. But with younger generations just the younger generations generally rather leaving the church at higher numbers, and Mormon feminists as well being more likely to leave the church and depart rather than advocate for change from within the church, all aspects of Exponent 2, its magazine, blog, and annual retreat, remain spaces for those who stay and those who leave to connect on their heritage and with each other. The quarterly magazine still arrives in mailboxes like a long letter from a dear friend. But Exponent 2 also reaches readers online through workshops and podcasts. It offers diverse perspectives, rejecting ideological purity, and captures the quiet voices shaping cultural shifts. As demographics and technology evolve, Exponent 2 continues nurturing a vibrant community of trust and belonging. For me, the last 3 years of researching this organization's history has been personally transformative. I have struggled with how to engage online outside of my own echo chambers of people who think like I do already. But Exponent 2 has shown me the value of listening to and empathetically engaging with people who are different from me. In the weeks after the most recent election, my work with Exponent has reminded me that it's not enough to look at one aspect of a person's identity and assume I already know the whole of them and can just write them off. People are more complex than their labels, and the context of their lives can change everything. Has it made a difference? Exponent 2 has been more than just a publication. It's been a lifeline to many women and gender minorities, both those who stay in the church and those who leave. By providing a platform for open dialogue, it has allowed Mormon feminists to share their stories, explore their identities, and navigate the complexities of their lives. Can someone be a Mormon and a feminist? It depends on who you ask. But for Exponent 2, the answer is yes. Thank you.
All right. So while the TAs are going to be able to give microphones to those who have questions, so just I guess take a minute to think about what questions you might want to ask. We have a few minutes here, maybe to just start off the questions. I'll ask one. A lot of I don't know, the founders or those who were involved kind of in the early years in Exponent 2 did any of them, I mean, talk about feminism outside of the LDS Church, or were involved in other big, I don't know, academic or political discussions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when they started meeting together in 1970, many of them were housewives, but some of them went on to graduate school. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, one of the founding mothers, got her PhD in history and went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for her book, A Midwife's Tale. And after winning the Pulitzer, there was a PBS documentary on her book and her process, and she ended up with a tenured professorship at Harvard University, where she spent the rest of her career. Claudia Bushman has also gone on to be a force in feminist writing and founded the Mormon Women's Oral History Project at Claremont University, and that collects oral histories from Mormon women around the globe. And there's been many other efforts as well, but those are two kind of highlights from the founding generation. That question.
Maybe let's do this, which we've done before, is because it is an intimidating setting with the stand and everything. Maybe take a minute to turn to somebody else, and I want you to think about what questions you might want to ask. Okay, and then we'll come back, and whoever's brave enough can raise their hand. Sound good? Okay, so on your own, talk to who's next to you. What are some questions that you have? Ready, go. All right, now you all have questions. Somebody want to raise their hand to ask one?
So, how did this movement relate to other feminist movements at the time? Because you talked a lot about how it related to the actual LDS Church, but did it have any interesting interactions outside of like with other feminist movements?
That's a great question. Exponent 2 was largely speaking to Mormon women, and it was not interacting a lot directly with other feminist groups. But the individuals within Exponent had a wide variety of ways that they may be engaging with other groups. Like Judy Duce, who was part of other women's consciousness raising groups, went on to do lots of other efforts at Suffolk and became a dean so she was one who directly and personally engaged with some of those other groups. Many individuals, participants over the 50 years have, but Exponent 2 itself has maintained its focus on creating space for Mormon women and gender minorities to be able to speak openly. And over the decades, there tends to be waves of women who have what they consider a feminist awakening. And there ends up being like new waves and new generations of women who tend to ask a lot of the same questions that these women were asking in the 1970s, and they're asking them again, and they don't have a place to ask these questions, and then they come to Exponent 2 and have that platform.
You might have already said this, but are there any, like, is the church now acknowledging Exponent 2, or is it still kind of separate?
That's a great question. So Exponent 2 is definitely independent from the church, and it's not, directly affiliated with the church in any way. But after 1975, when they had those interactions with general authorities coming, Exponent did not face that kind of direct interference. That was not the case for other feminist groups and individuals, though. So there was a big wave of retrenchment in the 1990s, and you may be familiar with the September 6th excommunications in September of 1993, where there were 6 individuals excommunicated for their writing and their publishing, some about feminism and some about other complicated issues of history. And some of these individuals were people who were friends with Exponent people or who had published in the paper, but it was not Exponent 2 staff or main writers who faced the excommunications themselves. It was friends and associates closer to church headquarters in Salt Lake that had kind of the heat of that moment. So is Exponent embraced by the church today? I would not say on an institutional level that it is, but it does not face that kind of interference. And Exponent 2 has kind of been a place where a lot of kind of a who's of people who came on to be significant contributors to Mormon history. A lot of them passed through Exponent in some way or another. Kate Holbrook was an associate editor for a time and became a major voice for Mormon women's history at the church history department. And so I think there is a different relationship than in the 1970s, but not one that is a close relationship.
What would you say are the biggest differences in beliefs and ideologies between the LDS Church and like the fundamental ideas of feminism?
So differences in the beliefs of the church and feminism? That's a great question. So Mormon feminism itself is not one that tends to cling to a particular, in academic study, there's different discussions of feminisms and different emphasis and approaches. Mormon feminism is more general of the idea of equality between the sexes, and that the belief that that is compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Does the church practice gender equality? That is something that most Mormon feminists would say it does not, right? In the opportunities of leadership, of decision-making about budgets, about building, about church discipline, there are still no women on councils, like church disciplinary councils. Women are underrepresented in on all major councils in church leadership that are mixed gender or male only. And so I think Mormon feminism still believes that there is an aspect of compatibility, that gender equality is compatible with what they consider to be the core gospel of Jesus Christ. But is that reflected in the current church structure? They would generally say no.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming. And for the rest of you, I know that Katie's willing to answer any questions if you feel more comfortable just one-on-one, or if you need to talk to me about anything with the class. But let's give a big round of applause for Katie Ludlow Rich.